We have with us today Professor Peter Linneman. Professor Linneman served as the founding chairman of Wharton's real estate department and was the director of Wharton's Samuel Zell and Robert Lurie Real Estate Center for 13 years. Dr. Linneman has also been named one of the 100 most powerful people in New York real estate, according to the New York Observer, and one of the 25 most influential people in commercial real estate by Realtor Magazine. Since 2001, Professor Linneman has been publishing the Linneman Letter, a highly regarded one-stop shop quarterly publication for commercial real estate investors and anyone seeking to understand the current macroeconomic environment. But perhaps the most fulfilling part of his life is Save a Mind, a charitable foundation to support the education of children in Kenya, which he founded with his wife, Kathy, which we will talk about later on in the episode.
It's great to spend time with you. And you mentioned Sam. You and I got to see Sam at work up close when you were with me in Kenya a few years back.
Yeah, and it was definitely a great experience. Yeah. Thanks again for the invitation.
It was great fun.
Let's start with your story. What prompted you to go into the study of real estate and economics more broadly?
Well, let's start backwards. I was talking to a friend a couple of weeks ago, actually doing an interview of him for the children of the charity that we do. We do a Zoom every 5 weeks, and he was talking about careers, and he asked me, how did I decide to be an economist? And I said, as a child growing up, I wanted to be a tarot card reader, but it took too much technical skill, so I became an economist. I was a blue-collar kid, blue-collar family. Grew up in a blue-collar town. It would now be called Rust Belt, but when I'm growing up, it was not rusty. It was, Ford and Westinghouse and U.S. Steel and Standard Oil of Ohio and railroads at their peak. And my father was a laborer, and he never graduated high school. My mother did graduate high school. One of my 4 siblings went to university. The other 3 didn't. And I sort of went to university, and I met an amazing woman, Dr. Lucille Ford. I talk to her every day. She's 101.
Wow.
I still talk to her every day. She was one of those women of that generation. She was the only woman in her MBA class in 1946 at Northwestern. She was on 5 Fortune 500 boards, and before it was trendy in the 1970s and 80s. She got her PhD when she was well into her 40s in economics, and I was fortunate enough to meet her. She was teaching economics at the time, and I kind of liked economics, and she was very charismatic and very inspirational. You get to the end of college, and you sort of start thinking, what should I do? And she said, you should go to the University of Chicago and learn economics under Milton Friedman and George Stigler and the people of the then Chicago schools. So I did. And it was an extraordinary experience. There were all these Nobel Prize winners around, or Nobel Prize winners to be around. I got 3 of them on my thesis committee. I had a number of others I dealt with. I dealt a lot with Milton Friedman. And after about 3.5 years, I was done with my dissertation, my PhD, and then you go, what are you going to do? And Gary Becker and George Stigler both end up winning Nobel Prizes, were wonderful to me. And they said, well, why don't you join the business school faculty? You can go, okay, seems good. And so you did that a couple of years, and then I had Jeremy Siegel, had been a professor of mine at the University of Chicago, had moved to Wharton, and he called and said, why don't you join Wharton? We'd like to try to hire you. I'm simplifying. That was 1979. And one thing led to another, and I accepted to come to Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania. And within a week of when I had accepted, and we had decided to move to Philadelphia, which is where we're sitting now, I got a call first from Scott Paper, which was headquartered here and was the 3rd or 4th largest manufacturer of paper. paper products. And then a week later, in that same week, I got a call from Michelin Tire, which was the only company in the world that made a radial tire that worked. This is a long time ago. Tires used to last about 9,000 miles prior to that. Now they last 90,000, 100,000. Anyway, they both called and they said, oh, we are told we should hire you as a consultant. And I said, sure. And how much do you charge? No idea. And I knew a couple of people who had done a little consulting while they were at Chicago, and I named a number. They said, fine. I said, damn, I should have said higher. And that's where Linneman Associates starts, which is in 1979, I took a couple of gigs. I didn't know how long they would last. I didn't know what I'd do. I don't know why anybody would have hired me at that point to be a consultant. And then I had a run where people just kept somebody else and somebody else. And those two companies I did for about 8 years each, and meanwhile others. And then by 1985, we had a dean, Russ Palmer, who was an amazing man, still alive, and asked me almost as a consulting exercise as a faculty member to look if we should kill real estate at Wharton or grow it. Because at that point, it was a real disgrace, a truly disgrace. And I was not involved with it. I was in the finance faculty, teaching economics and finance and so forth. And I looked at it and said, yeah, this industry, remember, this is 1985. This is a very underprofessionalized industry. Wharton's in the business of professionalization, and we should be at the vanguard of it. A lot of interesting topics. And I said, that's my advice. And he came back and said, well, why don't you do it? I said, I don't know anything about it. And I said, well, we can solve that. You're good at learning. I said, okay. And we got people like Al Taubman and Mel Simon and Mort Zuckerman, and Gene Cohn just passed away from the Cohn-Pedersen-Fox. And there were 17 of them who basically taught me real estate and built the Wharton program. Wow. And that 17, now that program's been going since 1985, and they get 600 people at their conferences and the who's who, and I was a small part of it. And one of the things I'm proudest of, no one knows do you know who invented the pencil? You have no idea.
No.
But you use a pencil all the time. And in a funny way, and I'm sure a number of people kind of were important to figuring out how to make a pencil. That's a little bit my role in professionalizing real estate over the last, almost 40 years, which is nobody knows, but essentially all these real estate programs around the world and in the United States are some imitation or rejuvenation or expansion of what we figured out at Wharton, and have massively professionalized. You know that as an individual who's a professional in the real estate. There weren't people like you. There were some people who were professional, but not much. So that was a very satisfying, we achieved our goal of helping to professionalize the industry, and whether it was books or whatever. But it was the whole approach was the real thing.
Actually, the book that you wrote, that you authored, I think it's used all over the U.S. right now.
Yeah,
right?
I think
there's
a book called Real Estate Finance and Investments. I don't know what edition we're in. I don't know, 7th or 8th. Last couple editions, a former student, Bruce Kirsch, has been a great partner and has modernized it. I mean, you know me well enough. I'm not going to develop a lot of Excel worksheets to match up with, but you need to for today's.
Yeah.
So Bruce has modernized it, if you will, and we keep upgrading it. We've been doing it, I don't know, probably 25 years the book has been, and it's widely used in universities, but it's also, if you go to Blackstone or Goldman Sachs or Eastdil, they'll put it on your desk and say you're responsible to learn it. And so that's kind of nice to know that a lot of people have. If you go into education, the whole point is you believe you might help people a little bit. And to see that being used is very rewarding. Or with the Linneman Letter, to see somebody says, oh, I read it and I disagree with what you say. Well, that's great. I'm happy because if they disagree, at least they're thinking about it. I achieved my job. Education is not about being right. You obviously try to be right, but it's about think and make you think about things. So that's all been very nice.
So you mentioned the Linneman Letter. So I think what it talks about mostly is macroeconomics. So I want to switch gears a little bit to what's going on in the U.S. economy, and more generally, what do you see the U.S. economy in the next few months? How is it going to behave? What trends are you seeing, metrics, etc.?
So let me step back one and say, if you're investing in real estate, don't get so hung up about what happens in the next few months, because it's not a trading asset. Now, you could say REITs you can trade, right? That's a separate phenomena. And my approach, as you know, is not as a trader, but more as an investor. And Mike Milken had a phrase, and I think I've got it right, which is, if you want to be a trader, what you need to know is what's coming across the television in the next 5 minutes. And if you want to be an investor, you need to know what's going to be in the newspaper 5 or 7 years from now, right? And and it picks up the spirit. Now, having said that, the U.S. economy, as we sit here, and I think it's 1st of May, as we sit here, is in much better shape than people think. And the Fed is doing their best to destroy the economy. It used to be that I would say no man's safe while the legislature's in session, but it extends to the Fed.
Yeah.
And of course it extends to the Fed. I'll come back to that. And in fact, before we come to the economy that way, I remember 50 years ago, in a couple of months, it'll be 50 years since I took my first class as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And I remember Milton Friedman, this is 50 years ago, saying the Fed always believes they have more control over the economy than they do. They always act late. They always overreact, and they're always subject to groupthink. Okay? That sounded all familiar? 50 years later, which is to say it's part of the DNA. And sometimes it's less dramatic others. And I sometimes say that the Fed, and I think more broadly, government in general, whether it's with fiscal policy or regulatory policy, believes that they're driving a high-performance automobile on a test track in perfect weather conditions. That's the kind of control they have. And the real truth is they're driving a jalopy with bald tires on ice in a blizzard, which is to say, of course, they have some influence. I mean, of course, the system has some influence, but not precise and not immediate and not nearly as much as you think. And it can be quite dangerous in that regard because you can oversteer and cause problems. And we're living through one of those periods where they're late. They've been subject to groupthink. They overreacted. They're not acting correctly at this point. So come back to the U.S. economy. Quite strong. We're adding jobs. We added 236,000 jobs last month. Everybody in America is happy about that, except
Federal Reserve.
You got it. If we had lost 500,000 jobs last month, everybody in the country would be unhappy, except
Federal Reserve.
Doesn't that tell you how screwed up their model is? And
they're using the Phillips curve still, right?
They still believe in the Phillips curve. Or at least they mutter that they believe in the Phillips curve, even though all the research done in the 1970s and 1980s, which was when inflation was high, says there is no identifiable statistical relationship, and it's not very theoretically sound. But other than not being theoretically sound and not statistically verifiable or verified, it's perfect. And for those who don't know, it's a trade-off that says there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and there isn't. And if you act as if there's a trade-off between something where there is no trade-off, you're just going to be steering a car and doing nothing. It's like, you give a little child sometimes your BlackBerry with no battery, and they believe that they're you, but it doesn't achieve anything, right? So the economy is in pretty good shape. Unemployment is low. Labor force participation is picking up. I found it funny that people said nobody is ever going to work again at a hotel. Remember that? Oh, of course they're going to work at a hotel. Nobody's ever going to work in a restaurant again. That's what you heard 3 years ago as we sat here, right? In May of 2020. Nobody's ever going to work in a hotel again. Well, you say, well, that's just stupid. That's just stupid. They're not. No one's ever going to fly again. Remember, no one's ever going to want to travel again because that's just stupid. All sales are going to be taken care of online. And well, that was just stupid. And, I didn't get everything right, but I got those right, that people come back to work. So everything the economy is going through right now is economic long COVID. You've heard about long COVID, where you have coughs and weaknesses and foggy brain longer than you've had COVID many. Well, what we've got are those kind of after effects of COVID and the reactions we took and governments took. We wouldn't have the inflation. The inflation issue would not have existed absent COVID. We wouldn't have had the runaway government spending. We'd have had excessive government spending, but we would not have had the excessive government spending absent COVID. We wouldn't have had all kinds of economic things. We wouldn't have had supply shut down. Remember, you couldn't shop in a mall for several months. Literally, they were shut down. And so there's a whole lot of things. So what happened to the economy is all kinds of adjustments, and we're coming back. But I'll give you a couple of things about the economy people don't understand. We have about $4.5 trillion as consumers, more cash than we had at the beginning of the pandemic. $4.5 trillion in cash. I don't know about you, but that's a lot of money as cushion that we didn't have before. It was up as high as $5 trillion. It's down a bit. Which is, we didn't have that when you go back to 2008. That's way beyond anything we had. Second, about 42% of all American households locked in their mortgage at around 2% for 30 years. You say, well, how do you get to 42%? Real quick. 2/3 of American households own their home, and 1/3 have no mortgage. 2/3 have a mortgage. So 2/3 of 66% gets you right around there. And they all locked in really low mortgages in 2020, 2021, early 2022, right? And they've got it for 30 years, a mortgage that's probably 2 to 3 percentage points lower than any time in history. That means that they've got $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 more to spend than you would ever expect them to have given circumstances. I was like, wow, that's a powerful tool. The economy still has a lot of momentum. GDP is still about 3% below trend. Now, just think about that. Pre-pandemic trend, okay? So we've had 3 years since the pandemic began. And you would expect, let me make it simpler. Let's say we think we're going to normally grow 2.5% a year in real terms. 3 years of that gets you to 7.5%. I'm ignoring compounding, just for those who want to be mathematically correct. But 3 years would get you 7.5%, and we're 2.5% short of that trend, which is to say in 3 years, we grew 2 years. We've got a year of growth still to come. That I don't know if we get it back in the next week. I doubt it if we get it in the next week, but we're getting it back. It's concentrated in travel and tourism. Think about it. Travel and tourism is still a little below its pre-pandemic level. If we'd have been having this conversation 3 years ago, prior to the pandemic, and you'd say, how much travel will there be 3 years from now? You'd have said, I don't know, 7% more, couple percent a year, right? So we have tremendous amount of pent up still in travel and tourism, not to mention the Europeans coming here, the Chinese just coming back, et cetera. Autos, we've way underconsumed autos because in 2020, first half of the year, you weren't allowed to buy them. Second half of the year, they couldn't make them because they couldn't get parts. That went into 2021. And we've just underconsumed automobiles. And we're going to do that. And that's going to be a powering. We've underproduced housing. And that's going to be a powering point. So we have a lot of, and one more, corporations. Yes, some corporations finance themselves with short-term money, but you saw a lot of corporations lock in their debt for 7 to 10 years at record low rates. That gives them a lot of resources to work with. So the economy's in pretty good shape except for one thing, and that is the Fed wants to create a recession. They want to get more unemployed people. Now just think of this. We're below trend real GDP. We are below trend employment. We don't have nearly as much as we did a few months ago, but you still talk to employers and there's a bit of labor shortfall. And they want to get more unemployment. And you just go, that can't make sense, right? So the Fed is waging war on the economy. They will tell you that inflation is quite high. So let's talk about inflation. They'll tell you year over year, inflation is somewhere between 4.5% and 5%. And that's true. Depends on what index you use. There's a whole bunch of them. 4.5% to 5% year over year. But that tells you about a year ago more than it tells you about now. I want to know what's happening now.
Yeah.
So let's look, for example, at month over month inflation. Well, for the last 6 to 7 months, month over month inflation, if you annualize it, is running somewhere between 1.3% and 3.6%. And of course, what that tells you is, a year ago, there was a jump. But over the last 6 months, there's no big jump. Annualized. So last month, annualized was 1.3%. Now, monthly has a lot of noise and so forth. By the way, wages, similar. When you take wages and you annualize the most recent wage increase, 2.8%. Year over year was more like 4.8%. Okay, but again, that's about a year ago. That's not about the activity that's happening now. So think about 2.8% annualized wage growth based on recent months. Well, productivity growth is going to push wages up. And historically, you get about 1.5% of productivity growth. So that should occur. That's not inflation, right? That's you deserve more money. You're more productive.
Productivity is going down now.
Well, over time, when you normalize, you get these spurts where it's quite high, and then you get a month or two where it's not. And we can come back to that. But if you net out the 1.5% normal productivity growth, it's a 1.3% inflation. And you kind of go, I'll get that. The productivity is interesting in a lot of ways. Productivity tends to rise when you lay people off and tends to fall when you hire people. Not because anybody's individual productivity is changing, but you're changing the mix. So just imagine a room where you had 10 people and you actually get to choose which one to let go. It's not a random. Which one are you going to let go? The highest productivity or the lowest?
The lowest.
Lowest. What happens to average productivity? It goes up. Even though the other 9 had no change in their productivity, measured productivity went up, right? Now we let another person go. Who do we let go? Lowest. What happens to average? It goes up even though the 8 are no more productive. Now do it in reverse. We have 8 people working and we bring back 1. Who's it likely to be? It's a younger person, a more marginal person in terms of their skills. And we hire, the 8 have no change in their productivity, but what happens to productivity? It falls mathematically. Why is productivity showing some bouncing around a negative? It's because we're adding so many jobs. So we had a period when I think it was in 12 months, we brought back 5 million people. What do you think happens to productivity?
It goes down.
Even though nobody's productivity No, it actually goes down, right? Because I'm bringing in these 5 million who tend to be lesser productive, right?
Yeah.
And even though nobody's productivity fell, you could have everybody's productivity falling, but if I'm bringing enough in. So we're in this odd period of data. So the economy's quite good. The Fed has completely misread the situation. Until 3 weeks ago, there was no dissent. Now think about that. All the people you talked about, all the people you read, some say the Fed was doing the right thing, some saying they're not, some here's why they should, here's why they shouldn't. No dissent among the members of the Fed? You don't think that's groupthink? Now, since then, you've had 3 of the regional presidents, Chicago, Dallas, and New York, have said, well, maybe we've pushed it as far as we should. I'm being more transparent than they said it, but that's kind of what they, and that's good because nobody knows the right thing. But when you have no dissent, you're not going to do the right things. So,
and how are you so sure that the inflation picture is moderating? Like I saw the PCE quarter over quarter. You see, like last quarter, Q4 came at 3.9%, I believe, and PCE this quarter came at 4%.
Look at
and
the
core
month over
PCE,
month, but look at the month over month. So the month over month I'm doing from memory was something like 1.8% month over month. Now I don't want to make too much of that because there's noise.
Yeah.
I could do day over day inflation, right? There's noise. Now, one of the reasons I'm convinced that we don't have much inflation is if I go to month over month for the last few months, you don't see much. But even more so is housing. And housing depends which metric you're using, is a big component. Housing is both oddly measured and given the way they measure it, it lags somewhere between 4 and 6 months. The reason they're not completely, the BLS is not completely stupid. If you're trying to track cost of living, okay, tracking rent changes captures cost of living for renters. Fair enough? More or less, right? But do home prices going up means the cost of the living has gone up for homeowners? No, that's an asset.
Yeah.
And in fact, they've locked in their rent. That's one of the things you do when you're a homeowner is lock in your rent. And the only thing you worry about then are operating costs like repairing the roof and fixing a door and so forth. So with the renters, what they did was say, well, Jonathan, your lease was 12 months long. So even if rent went up a lot this month, your rent didn't go up. Well, for some of you it did, but your rent was locked in for a month. So that's one of the reasons the lag comes in. You get the intuition of it, right? The second, with homeowners, what they did is instead of tracking operating maintenance costs for owners, which would be perfectly logical, they took the approach, and I actually had something to do as a researcher with this methodology, not for that purpose, but they try to go find a home like yours that's rented and then say, how much is the rent of your home gone up? But again, with this lag effect. Well, come on. Lots of homes have no renter equivalent. They just don't, even with the world of invitation homes and so forth, right? So it's an odd methodology because for 2/3, they're doing something. It's almost like saying, well, what would I rent to you if you were my neighbor? And what would you rent to me if we just swapped and did? And it's an interesting intellectual experiment, but it's odd because for homeowners, the real truth is there's no inflation from rent happening for homeowners. There is to the extent washers and, replacement doors and things like that, right? But that's not what they do. So you have this very odd thing, housing, it lags. It picks up something that changes but doesn't really change for 2/3 of the population. And for the 1/3, it picks it up like 6 months late because of what we were saying. Now, why do I say all that? I say all that because you're in the real estate business. What's happened to apartment rents in the last 3 to 5 months? Nothing.
Flat, yeah.
Flat at best. You would agree? Flat at best. We know homeowners' rent didn't change by definition because they are homeowner, they don't pay rent. Okay? So if you say, if I really handled housing cost, I'd look at the renters and say, well, they spend their money, and I'd look at the homeowners and say, how much have replacement gone up? And that's a small part of all their spending, though, right? So, and what you'd find is it's zero. Well, what's been the biggest factor for the last quarter, actually a little longer than the last quarter, what's been the biggest factor pushing the inflation numbers? Housing. But if you're in the business at all, you know that the rental part, it's zero at best, maybe slightly negative. And for the homeowners, you know it's zero. So you know, in fact, the real number for housing is zero for the last several months, even though they've got it in as the highest number pushing inflation. If I were to put in zero for housing, remember that 1.3%? Yeah. It goes. Now, people ask me, if you can figure this out, why can't they? And I could make some snarky comment, but I won't, because I'm not that smart compared to them. That's not the point. It's groupthink. It's they get used to and so forth. But remember, organizations filled with competent people, well-educated people, well-trained people, thoughtful people, make some horrific operational decisions. And I'll give you 2 examples of that. One from Republicans, one from Democrats. I'm not political in the least. How did Richard Nixon's team, he was in the process of winning a landslide election, and his team felt compelled to break into the Democrats' national headquarters. These are well-educated people, well-trained people, serious people. They broke into the national headquarters and they tried to cover it up. And that resulted in a sitting president having to resign. And you go like, how could intelligent people do that? And it happens. Let me give you one on the Democrats, just so people don't think I'm picking on. You know that the people who tried to plan the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they went all to the right schools. They're all perfectly intelligent people. They're all trying to do a good job. Nobody is trying to say, well, let's screw it up. Nobody was trying to say that. And yet, there it is. The withdrawal, the actual operational withdrawal, was horribly botched. And nobody would say to the contrary. Even a rock-rid Democrat would say, well, they would only say it was botched as opposed to horribly botched. Not because people are evil or wrong. You know they fell into some type of groupthink that ignored real realities. Right?
I think that's the best case against centralization and government control. The fact that if you have decentralization, you have different organizations making decisions, and if you have one organization with groupthink that makes a bad decision, then they go out of business. But if it's the government, the government cannot go out of business.
Yeah,
so they
it won't go out of business. Won't go out of. I guess you could argue there's a few failed states, right, where they literally go out of business. But you're right. And by the way, they're all filled by human beings with all their foibles and flaws and so on. So if I make a mistake, I don't know, my listeners suffer, right? My company suffers. But if you give me the power to set the price of money, tens of millions, hundreds of millions suffer if I don't do it right. And that's if I'm trying to do well. I'm not, And then you say, well, it attracts certain types of people. Power attracts certain types of people more than other things. It tends to attract people who like power, and people who like power can be very helpful, but they can also be quite dangerous, the history would show. And so, yeah, I mean, that is the most compelling. I always found it funny how somebody would say, we need a regulation because those people are venal and nasty and trying to cheat people. Okay. And it could be true, right? There are venal people who are trying to cheat. And and we need a regulation and a government body to supervise them, right? Who's going to fill the government positions except human beings? And some of those human beings are going to be venal and corrupt and incompetent. And now they're just at a bigger scale of it, right? And so I'm not saying there are never moments for it, but you have to step back and say, it's just human beings. It's Milton Friedman made a comment. You remember certain things people say. And one of the comments he said is when people say, the government ought to do this, the government ought to do that. It was a really good piece of advice, which is substitute the words all-knowing, omnipotent, benign being should do, right? Don't say government. Say an all-knowing, omnipotent, benign being should do that. Well, of course, there's no shortage of things that an all-knowing, omnipotent, should do. But unfortunately, all-knowing, omnipotent, benign beings are in short supply.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the Fed, given that, these are perhaps the most powerful people in the U.S. right now.
They're certainly among it, yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, let's examine more closely how the Fed reacted to the pandemic and what's the entire monetary policy that they have. But I'm thinking there's a consensus that the Fed saved the economy and that it was amazing everything that they did, printing all this money during the pandemic. What I'm thinking is that if you have everybody talks that the Fed printed all this money, so they basically gave money to everyone and people had money to spend. Right. So that didn't cause a deflationary spiral and they basically saved the economy. But what I'm thinking is nobody talks about the supply side. I mean, the supply during COVID disappeared. So isn't it common sense that if the supply disappears of products, of goods and services, and you just print more money and you expand the money supply, isn't that going to cause inflation?
Well, it's not like nobody has talked about that. I've talked about that pretty consistently. Let's take your question or your comment in a couple of parts. One, let's be honest. Once it was decided we were going to shut down the economy and we had this disease of unknown virulence, right? Nobody knew what to do. I mean, I think that's fair to say. Literally, certainly no economists knew what to do. And as we look back, no epidemiologists knew what to do. Everybody was trying, or almost everybody was trying to do the right thing, but in pretty close to total ignorance, okay? We had never shut down an economy. The closest thing you got was a war or something like that, or a recession. We had never closed down an economy, not just us, the whole world. Do I think the Fed did the right thing more or less out of the chutes? March 2020. Yeah, because if they had not put some notable amount of money into the system, we could have had, I'm not saying we would have, we could have had, nobody knows, just spiraling downward. Because you're doing nothing of everything. Namely, you're buying nothing. Therefore, I have no money to pay anybody. And since I have nobody to pay anybody, I can't pay my workers or my suppliers or my lenders. And since I can't pay them, they can't pay theirs. I mean, just imagine what happens if an economy shuts down, truly shut down, right? It's not pretty to think about what could have happened. Could, not would. Could. We don't know. So the notion of, I don't want a bank to foreclose because you can't pay them this month. right? Not a stupid notion. But then how do you get the banks not to go out of business if nobody's paying them? And you go, I have an idea. We're going to give them money through QE. And there was a massive QE. So that means that they still have money even though nobody's paying them, right? And you go, okay, it's not a perfect solution, but okay. And by the way, I would say the same thing about CARES 1, moving away from the Fed. CARES 1, I wasn't alive during World War II, was probably the best government spending bill I ever saw. Was it perfect? No. Was there probably 10 to 15% of the money wasted, fraud, and abuse? Yes. But did you know what would happen if, by the way, at one point, by the end of March, 23% of the labor force was collecting unemployment, right? And you didn't know how long that was going to last. I didn't know how long that was going to last. Should we not give them unemployment? Should we? Well, where are we going to get the money? Okay, have it printed and the Fed can buy it and we'll. Okay, so was it perfect? No, none of it was perfect. It was all human. So out of the chute, I would give them high marks. Perfect marks, nobody knows what perfect is. Then you say, moving beyond that, the economy started recovering. Demand started coming back. It was clear that supply of everything was going to lag demand coming back. Thank God. And why do you thank God? 2 reasons. What if demand had never come back? What if permanently we lost all those capacity to work? That'd been a nightmare, right, for the economy to absorb. Thank God demand came back. What's the problem? Supply didn't come back as fast. That created inflation. You say, well, what if supply had come back faster than demand? We'd have had a nightmare. Why? If supply came back faster than demand everywhere, what would have happened to prices? They'd have plummeted. You wouldn't have been able to pay your loans. You wouldn't have been able to pay your workers as much, right? So that you'd have had, instead of inflation to manage, you'd be managing deflation.
But what's the problem with deflation in general? Because people talk about this idea of the economy overheating, as if like the economy was a car that overheats.
And it wasn't. It wasn't.
And what's the problem with deflation?
So
too much employment, too much productivity, too much, because like in the natural state of the economy, if the economy is growing and people are productive, prices come down. Okay,
so let's take that in 2 parts. Well said. The problem with inflation, or a problem, I should say, of inflation, a textbook kind of problem, is if everybody believes the price of everything will be lower tomorrow, I'm not going to buy anything today. And now you get into how long is tomorrow. Because if nobody buys anything today because they're waiting for tomorrow, I don't have any money to pay the workers today, right? Because everybody's waiting until tomorrow because prices are going to fall. That's the theoretical issue. Now, then you mention a functioning economy. Okay, let me ask you. And in fact, there's this phrase that Milton Friedman had. I don't want to make this an homage to Milton Friedman, but he did say a lot of useful things. Keynesians who have spent their entire life attacking Milton Friedman and everything he stood for, okay? We need big government, we need government intervention, all this, which Milton was against. Suddenly quote one thing Milton said as if it was brought down from the mount, and that is inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, which he did say. But if you would have sat in a class, what you would have heard him say is, because it's inconceivable that across an entire economy there would be excess demand in everything, because economies kind of work. And yes, you're going to have excess demand for some and excess supply for others, and most being more or less norm, okay? And therefore, such a situation can't drive prices, because you could only get inflation created if everything was in a supply shortfall. And at the time he said that, he was right, because we had never had a complete supply shortfall. What did we have at the end of March 2020, at the end of April 2020, at the end? We had a fundamental shortfall of everything
Yeah.
Everything, almost everything in the economy. And as you say, prices went up. And it came to be called a supply chain issue. But more to the point, it was supply lagging demand. Why did supply lag demand? 23% of the labor force was collecting unemployment. You want to lead? You want to get out ahead of that? I don't think so. You're going to lag. You're going to, let's let them show that they're willing to spend, right? And sure enough, they did. And supply lagged. And it took longer than I thought. I thought it would take about 6 months. It's taken closer to 18 months. So the New York Fed has this index of supply chain problems. And it peaked at something like 4 standard deviations. Guess when? When inflation was at its highest. And you know statistics, so what does 4 standard deviations mean? We've never seen anything like this before, is what 4 standard deviations mean, right? And now it's back slightly below average. And you go, oh, 1.3%. Now, I'm not trying to say it is quite literally that mechanical, but the reason we had inflation was not so much the Fed put money in the system. The economy is still underheated. How do I know that? We're a year short of growth. We're 2.5% short of where the economy should be. We're about 750,000 workers short of where it should be. That's not overheated. By the way, if you told me, based on pre-pandemic numbers, GDP is 10% above trend, I'd say, ooh, maybe that is overheated. If you told me we've got 7 million more than trend employed, I'd say, ooh, maybe that's overheated. That's not what we have.
I think the basic premise is that overheating, the premise there is that the more we grow, the more inflation we will have. So that's why we call it overheating. But like if you see during the late 19th century, we had deflation. And the economy was growing. It was like the best time. So can't there be a scenario where everything is growing? And just to finish up, like you mentioned that, you mentioned this scenario that people are gonna postpone spending because they think that things are gonna be cheaper. But let's say if I wanna eat a hamburger, I'm not gonna say I'm gonna eat a hamburger tomorrow because a hamburger is gonna be cheaper tomorrow. So people forget about the component that I want something now. The same with, let's say, TVs.
But if hamburgers fell fast enough in price, you'd wait till the afternoon. And how do I have the money to pay the people who are there at lunchtime? That's the extremum.
What about like an iPhone? So we know the next year Apple's gonna come with a better iPhone, and it's probably gonna be the same price or cheaper, the same as TVs. And we still buy iPhones right now,
absolutely, because
we want it now. We don't want it in a year.
And you're 100% right, and especially on technological products. You know that they're going to fall in price, and they're going to be better, and you buy them anyway because of their either joy or productivity, right, is offsetting that. There's no doubt on that. But so you want this productivity effect pushing down. Yeah. What you don't necessarily want is a non-productivity related pushing it down. That's the thing. And by the way, it's similar. If an automobile costs more because it's a massively better automobile, I don't worry about that kind of inflation, right?
Yeah.
But if an automobile that's no better costs a lot more, that's kind of inflation. And sorting that out is a challenge, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics tries. But you can imagine, no matter how hard you try, that's a really, really difficult job. And it does make some comparisons over time interesting. There's a wonderful book, I think it's Matthew Ridley, from about 5 years ago, called The Rational Optimist. And he starts out describing Louis XIV, the sun god of France, his life in Versailles. And it would be a life you would never live. You would never want to live because there's no indoor plumbing. The water is, putrid. The food rots in a matter of hours, etc. If you got an infection you might die of just a run-of-the-mill infection that today you'd put Neosporin on, or not to mention, and what he points out is how far we've progressed. How do you adjust for that in prices, right? I mean, and so in a lot of, we live better than the sun god did, in the late 1700s, and yet, right? So, yeah, I mean, you're not wrong in what you're saying, but it's a little more subtle. But I think you're dead on. The Fed put about $6.4 trillion into the economy, basically in the first year. It was even mostly in the first months of the pandemic. By the way, in the last year, the money supply, at least traditionally measured, has shrunk by something like 3%. Okay. And the money supply gets harder and harder to measure over my entire career, because are you including PayPal? Are you including, all that? And so when I was your age, the money supply was pretty directly measured. And now every week it just gets less effectively measured. And not surprisingly, a lot of the economic models calibrated like that become less effective. Having said that, traditionally measured money, the Fed put $6.4 trillion in. 1.4 trillion got used, and 5 trillion went and we buried it in our backyards. Now, we didn't literally bury it in our backyards. We put it in bank accounts, literally checking accounts mostly, and I'm sure a little bit in money market funds. Now, if it's buried in our backyards, let's take the extreme. You're in Latin America, you understand people burying their money in backyards, right?
Right.
It can't be pushing up prices. So if I hand you $6.50 and you take 5 of them and bury them, and everybody else takes 5 and buries them, you only have $1.50 that can be pushing prices, not the whole amount, which is to say the velocity fell dramatically if you go to a technical level. And you add to that, money's not perfectly measured in velocity. When I was young, velocity was quite stable. Over the last 20 years, velocity has not been stable, which makes it harder to model and analyze. Having said that, though, money that went in and just sat there is not the source of inflation. But I'll tell you what is a source of inflation: systematic shortfalls of supply across the economy. By the way, economies in Africa that put no money into their system also had inflation.
Yeah.
Why? Because demand and supply both fell. Demand came back faster than supply. And nobody has done a real careful study of this whole. You can imagine somebody is going to do a PhD, a number of people are going to do PhD theses on these years from now. It's like epidemiologically, they're going to do studies on who was most vulnerable for real on an individual level with COVID and so forth. But we're years away from that.
Is that why also QE didn't cause massive inflation? Because all that money stayed in the financial markets? Didn't that inflate the assets? Yeah.
So QE 1, 2, 3, which are the financial crisis related, late 2008 through mid 2014. Lots of money went in the system, and lots of people, including me, said, we're going to get a lot of inflation.
Yeah.
And consumer prices went nowhere. And in fact, asset prices didn't do much either for the first couple of years. And then you started seeing the money come out. If all it's doing is going in and being buried, no big deal. And it was going into the banks. Let's face it, what QE is, the Fed creates money. They buy they overpay banks for their assets that they want. Ginnie Mae's, Fannie Mae's, Freddie, AA, AAA. Not, by the way, they didn't buy from the regional banks a loan to a taco stand, right? Which is what regional banks do. They didn't buy from the regional banks a construction loan on a building like this. They didn't buy those. What did they buy? Ginnies, Freddies, Fannies, and so forth. Treasury. They overpaid for them. That's where QE came from. Where did that money get created? They just said you got it. You out of thin air. Only a government, you can't do that. Only a government can do that. Saying where you had no money, it now exists because I say it exists. Okay? So QE 1, 2, 3 occurred, and I kept expecting, not just me, everybody expected it to create inflation of consumer prices, and it never did. And that's because first it didn't come out at all. It just sat on deposits at the Fed earning interest. It was like money for nothing. First, we're going to overpay you for the assets, and then we're going to have you leave your money there, and we're going to pay you money for leaving it there. That's kind of a nice gift if you can get it, right?
But the banks didn't loan out that money?
No. If you look at the loans, you don't see a blip in the loans. You just
why is it that they didn't loan? Don't the banks have incentives?
Because they had huge incentives, and then some combination, without going into the detail, some combination of all the stuff of Dodd-Frank and stress tests. So they regulatory could lend it, and they had incentives to lend it, except for stress tests. And stress test says we're not going to tell you how we're going to evaluate your solvency. But if you fail, we can promise you it's going to come at the worst possible time. You're going to be a headline, and you're going to have to raise equity then. So you can imagine they went very cautious. I once made the analogy of what do you think people would do if the government, if the IRS said, we're not going to tell you what the tax laws are. No, we're not going to give you any idea of what the tax laws are. But if you underpay taxes, we know what they are, right? So the government knows what the tax structure is. You don't. And if you underpay, we're going to crucify you. What are people going to do? They're going to be very cautious, and they're going to tiptoe around the edges, and they're going to overpay taxes, right? What do you think happens when you tell banks, we're not going to tell, but we are telling you we're really stressing your portfolio. We're not telling you the mechanics and the algorithms. By the way, we're going to keep changing the algorithms. And it's very clever on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's like, this is my government trying to help me. They won't tell me even imagine what you'd react to if the government isn't going to tell you the tax system, but you've got to pay taxes and you'd be punished. That's bizarre.
I mean, that's essentially what happens now, right? Like,
well, at least you know the tax law. At least you don't. Your accountant does, right? Supposedly. So stress tests kept the money in, and you can imagine what the banks did. By the way, we're talking about not all the banks. We're talking about the money center banks, because they didn't buy a lot of assets from the regionals. They bought them from the money center banks. That's who had those assets. And you can imagine that slowly the money center bank said, well, I wonder if I do a bit more of these kind of loans, will I still pass the stress test? And you can imagine they're talking to people, trying to figure out, and they're seeing who else had what portfolio. Oh, they had a lot more consumer loans than we did, and they passed. So maybe I expand. So then you started basically seeing the money come out. But remember, at the money center banks, and the money center banks primarily lend to asset buyers, right? They're not lending for somebody to buy Wonder Bread. They're lending to somebody to buy the company that makes Wonder Bread, or the landlord of the building where they're doing big loans out of money center banks. And what did you see happen from 2014 through 2019? Asset prices rose. Go up. Everything. So they largely lent to asset owners, by the way, including homeowners.
Yeah.
Because why? Because yes, they're mom and pop loans, but that's the same document. I can securitize it, get rid of it. Same with auto loans somewhat, right? But not a taco stand loan, not a loan to develop a building, right? It was those. And you saw asset prices rise. Gold. It's hard, almost everything. The only things that didn't rise in value, 2014 to the beginning of COVID, were assets I owned. It sometimes feels that way, right? Every other asset rose. So we didn't have consumer price inflation. We had asset price inflation because they lent to asset owners or asset buyers. And it was a great reminder to me that when I first studied inflation, which coincidentally was in the 70s when there was high inflation all over the world, inflation is defined as the on-average movement in prices. Doesn't say consumer prices.
Yeah.
Prices, because you don't know where it comes through. And then the BLS decided we're going to focus on consumer prices because, quite frankly, they're easier in many cases. I mean, to measure the price of, how do you measure the price of a construction loan month to month? I mean, it varies, but
it's
you can imagine doing some DCF model and whatever and algorithms. But so they decided to stay with consumer prices, and we just all got used to it. And then what happened in the 2010s where we had no consumer, but we had a lot of inflation. It was asset. Then we had QE infinity with COVID. And so, again, the money went in, and most of it hasn't come out. Most of it is still sitting there, either on bank deposits at the money center banks, not at the regionals. So why is it that the regionals have problems when interest rates go up? Because, well, take SVB. Think about what the Fed did. The Fed said, by the way, if I'd have said, think about the difference. Let me set this up. Imagine Peter says, you know what? We're going to raise interest rates, and we're not going to raise interest rates for some time. Nobody acts on that because I don't control anything, right? But when the Fed says, we're not going to raise interest rates for some time, and you look, and the last time they really said that, it took them 8 years. 8 years. That's a whole separate discussion. It took them 8 years, even though the economy was growing, before they raised them. And even then, they were raising them fairly slowly. What would any rational player think? Well, maybe they raise it in 2 years, but certainly not in 4 months. And a couple of months after having said that, the Fed said, oops, we were only kidding. We're going to raise them and raise them rapidly. What that meant was that it changed the asset prices, just bond pricing kind of exercise. And you look at SVB, who I'm sure felt pretty safe given it took 8 years the last time owning 3 to 5 year treasuries, figuring I'll hold them to maturity. And no big problem. And then suddenly they're whipsawed and they created a lender strike. So
I think also if you add to that the banking regulations, they were incentivizing these banks to hold government debt essentially, and they, because they didn't have to mark them to market.
Right.
So if
unless they were held for sale. So the accounting rules, I'm not an accountant, but I've sat on a lot of audit committees. Unless they've been designated, they're being held for sale. Well, most of the banks are not holding their assets for sale because they think their deposits are stable and maybe even growing. So why would I'd meet any liquidity needs I have out of growing deposits and loans paying off, right? So they had nothing held for sale.
It seems like the Fed, I mean, they're just, and the government, they're just experimenting with
you're
with
being
the
a little cruel. You're right, but you're being a little cruel.
But I'm wondering what you think.
They're just human.
Yeah.
I would say it a little differently. They're just human, like us, who are sometimes given tasks bigger.
Yeah.
All right. So if I had cancer, thank God I don't, well, at least to my knowledge, don't have cancer. And I go into a doctor. Do you think the doctor really knows what to do about my cancer? Of course not, because everybody reacts differently. Every cancer is different. Every individual is different. The same cancer is going to affect you differently at your age and health and than my age and health and so forth, right? It's a task beyond the individual given the state of the science. That doesn't mean they're not going to try to do a good job. But, and by the way, to the extent they're imperfect and they're a bit political, it gets tougher, worse.
But the question is, should the Fed have that job in the first place? I mean, and if we eliminate the Fed, because I was looking at some charts of before in 1913, before the creation of the Fed, and actually the economy didn't have that much of a problem.
Well, it had the same problems, which is every once in a while they used to call them crises.
Yeah.
Right. And they had, with some regularity here and abroad, crises, right? And there's a whole literature, I'm no longer fully up on it, that examined exactly what you're saying. And suffice it to say, at least the last I looked at the literature, it's a close call. And you can imagine during the Great Moderation, right before the financial crises, there were people saying, see, what was a close call no longer is a close call. And then you have the financial crisis. And you kind of go, oops, well, we didn't have that in our analysis.
But if we eliminate the Fed in general, what can substitute and who's going to set up interest rates? Or you
don't need to set interest rates.
So the market will set up interest rates.
Market could set interest rates. It's more, the difficult question is who's going to provide liquidity. And because if an economy is growing, just think of more people, growing economy, you do need more money. It's like you need a bigger suit, right, to fit you as you grow, right? Otherwise, there won't be enough money to go around. You're going to want to buy something, and you can't find any money because we still have the same amount of money we had when the Romans were ruling, right? And you go, well, that isn't going to work, right? So there have been two systems that have kind of been proposed. One is gold, okay? And gold has existed in many places. And you say, well, how do you get liquidity growing? And
more mining,
and so forth. And that's subject, and that's the plus, right? So you can expand the money. What's the negative? Do you really want to depend on what's the big gold mining country? Congo, Angola, mining. Do you really want to depend on those countries for controlling your liquidity? And that is frightening when you think about that. I mean,
I think when the U.S. was in a gold standard, the U.S. owned, I think, 66% of the gold.
And we were a big producer. But we're not a big producer anymore. So you can imagine, people, I think we had this conversation in Kenya some years ago. You at first can get very excited about gold. Not you, a person can. And then you realize, oh my God, all I'm doing is outsourcing my growth of liquidity to the Congo. And I don't care how bad you think the Fed is, I'd pick the Fed over the Congo.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and I'm not trying to beat up on the Congo, but to make the point, Russia, big supplier of gold right now. And you can imagine that if that was the source of imagine it was the only place that produced it, we outsourced the growth of our liquidity, and we do need liquidity for growth, to Russia or the Congo. That's why you don't want a gold standard. So then what do you want?
Adding to the gold standard, I think there's the other possibility that what if people, start advocating for another metal, like or Bitcoin,
it could be,
or something like
that.
The
problem is all these metals are held by some pretty nasty places.
Yeah,
I mean that. By the way, you can imagine gold kind of worked better when the world was not such an open place, right? When it was kind of a smaller and so forth. Okay, so then the Milton Friedman suggestion was a rule. And there are still advocates, and I would kind of advocate that, which is just a rule. The rule says money always grows, liquidity, and now we get back to what is money, right? Does it include PayPal? Liquidity will always increase by, I don't care. Let's say you think the economy grows 2% a year, and we give it 1% or 2% to grow on so the clothes aren't too tight, right? 4%. And we just, every year, every quarter, 1% growth. What's the problem with that? Well, you might have these extraordinary situations like we just had with COVID that no one would have ever imagined. No one who would have proposed a fixed rule would have ever imagined shutting down malls, shutting down the non-grocery side of Walmart, just to remind ourselves of where we were at, right? Nobody, remember they were checking people crossing state boundaries. You might say, well, 4% a year is not going to do it. We got to do something else. That's how you get to the Fed. Once you say, well, then we got to do it. But now you're into, do I trust them and the damage they do more than a rule? And again, without going into it, it's a close call. It's a close call. And you can make the argument come out any way you want, truthfully. And now that you've set up all this mechanism of the central banks, and now that you've got all the regulatory mechanism, do you really want to throw it away, having built it all?
Yeah. That's
kind of where we're at. Would you have built it if you knew everything you knew? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a lot of we covered a lot of monetary policy.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears to ask you about, in general.
By the way, one last thing on monetary.
Yeah,
just one last thing on the Fed. If I'm not on the Fed, I'm just another university professor teaching some course.
Yeah.
And then I'm named to the Fed, either as a regional or on the board. And I'm suddenly God. I'm no smarter. By the way, if that was me, I'm no smarter. I'm no dumber either. I'm probably more prone to groupthink because I got other things I'm managing, like all the regulatory oversight and so forth. I always find it funny how during my career, I'd know a student who had a professor who became a Fed member. 2 weeks before they became a Fed member, the student would be complaining about how dumb the faculty member was. Suddenly they're on the Fed and they're acting like they're omnipotent.
Yeah.
And they're just people.
Yeah. I think just to end the discussion on the Fed, I mean, I've never understood why there is an issue of liquidity, who manages the liquidity, but why don't they leave interest rates to the market?
Because what was happening in 1913 through the 1920s? It was the rise of socialism, communism. I'm not joking, right? Yeah. And it was in the air. And while we're setting this up, we should control prices because markets are dangerous. And what is an interest rate other than a price? And thanks God they only controlled a couple of the prices. But it was in the air. It was of the times. You say, well, why do we continue? Well, remember, the real reason that the Fed was created was not to stabilize the economy. The real reason was to stabilize banks, right?
Yeah.
To save the banks. And then certainly in the 30s, that was what it was about. Now, the intuition kind of was, well, if we save the banks, we'll stabilize the economic system. But first and foremost, it's save the banks. And if you look at their behavior, it's about saving the banks, saving the banking system. And yes, they would follow it on and say, and by so doing. But I think First Republic just got taken over today, and there's a sale to JP, and I'm sure they're going to backstop. And you're going, why? just let the damn thing fail would be, you're going to let a car dealer fail. You're going to let a restaurant fail. And the answer is, well, we can't let banks fail. Why? Because that's their customer. That's what they were created to do.
Yeah, I've noticed this trend in interest rates, this cycle that keeps on happening. And I don't know why I haven't heard anybody point that out, which is there's a recession. So they cut prices, they cut interest rates because they want people to take on more debt. So they take on more debt, and then they start. And then when the economy gets better, because everybody's like with the drug, if you take on a drug, then you feel invincible in the moment. But then after some time, they start raising interest rates until the interest rate becomes unserviceable. There is a default, and then they drop interest rates again, and it's a cycle forever.
You could argue that it's a make-work project, right? Where you need us. Why do you need us? Well, because of what we did before, right? There is an element of that. That's a little probably too scary, but there is no doubt that, by the way, think of the short-term interest rate. I mean, I sat on a lot of corporate boards in my life, and I've been involved in a lot of things. How much does a 50 basis point increase in the very short-term interest rate have on the investment decision to build a shopping center that's going to last 40 years? Not much. Yeah. Not much. I mean, weighted cost of capital, something, but effectively not at all. And therefore, a lot of that verbiage, like you said about, well, if I cut the interest rate, then people are more likely to borrow, and then they'll build and they'll buy, not nearly as much as you'd think. Do you think because if the short-term rate goes down, do you think people are going to go out and build a home? Not many. Again, in a weighted cost to capital sense. But what most long-term decisions are centered around is long-term cost of capital, which they don't control. Now, they started controlling with QE. That's why they started doing it, right? To buy assets, to set longer. Yeah. Anyway, the impact is, by the way, when you look at the empirical evidence, the impact of all these rate cuts and rate rises is not much except in the extremum. That's
why you say that interest rates and cap rates, there's not a clear-cut correlation.
Clear-cut correlation. First of all, there's no clear-cut theoretical correlation. And I give you why. I mean, I've thought about this a lot. I've done research on this. People think, well, if the interest rate goes up, the weighted cost of capital has to go up. And if the interest rate go down, the weighted cost of capital has to go down for real estate, and therefore the cap rate should move accordingly. Now, let me give you, I spell this out in Linneman Letter in several issues more extremely, but more carefully. Suppose when the interest rate goes down, there's nobody willing to lend to me. Okay?
Yeah.
So you can imagine I used to have 60% debt, 40% equity. The interest rate goes down and no one is willing to lend to me. Did my cost of capital go down? No, because I had to replace, quote, relatively cheap debt with relatively expensive equity, probably at a time, going back to why'd they cut the rates? Because things are dicey. So I probably not only have to replace debt with equity, I have to replace it at a time when equity is more expensive than normal. So what happened to the weighted cost of capital when the interest rate went down a whole lot? It actually went the other way.
Yeah.
And so you have this, and by the way, you can get the opposite result, and you get all these kind of movements and not really. And then when you look at it empirically, you just don't find a relationship. You find a relationship between the amount of money trying to get into real estate or trying to get out of real estate. You'll see cap rates respond to that.
And the interest rate usually has some influence in the availability of money.
Could. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
If the interest rate went up 13 basis points, probably not. If the interest rate goes down 2 percentage points, something's going on in the system. beyond interest rates, like a flight to quality or this or that or whatever. And it's those things that tend to dominate. And I use as an intellectual experiment, a thought experiment. We're sitting in Philadelphia. Suppose by the end of business tomorrow, $1 trillion more has to be lent to buy apartments in Philadelphia as exist right now. $1 trillion has to go into Philadelphia apartments, or everybody gets crucified in the business, right? We're just going to start crucifying loan officers. What do you think is going to happen to cap rates? They're going to go way down because that money is going to go. Nobody wants to get crucified, right?
Yeah.
By the way, suppose I told you at the end of business tomorrow, there can be no loans outstanding under any circumstances on apartments in Philadelphia, or we'll start crucifying. What do you think will happen to cap rates? They're going to skyrocket because there's no money for it. So, and you didn't ask what the interest rate was, right? You asked about the flow of funds. Now, granted, those are extreme. So the interest rates do not have, I remember sitting in a macroeconomics class, right? And you say, oh yeah, cheaper, everybody's going to borrow. But the answer is not everybody's going to borrow, right? Not everybody's going to borrow because most decisions are long-term, not short-term finance kind of decisions.
Yeah. I want to switch gears and ask you about the government intervention and what's the role of the government specifically in real estate. I know that we have a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. So I'm wondering what are your thoughts on this? Do you think these institutions should exist? I don't know if you saw the latest rules that they said that put forward.
Subsidy rates, the insurance rates.
Yeah,
Look,
which
Freddie
essentially
and Fannie,
for those that don't know, it's essentially a subsidy to those that if you put up a higher down payment and you have a higher FICO score, you get a higher interest rate. But so you're penalizing essentially people that have been responsible with their credit.
But first of all, that
create a
shouldn't
bubble
surprise.
in the future.
That shouldn't. Let's take it in two steps. Are you surprised that a government agency is very interested in redistribution? Because you could argue what markets are about is trying to be productive. Not perfectly. There's been tremendous amounts of things done wrong and imperfectly and unproductively in a market economy. But first and foremost, it's about trying to create and produce, okay? And it's not terribly surprising that first and foremost, the government is interested in redistribution. Always has been, always will be.
Yeah.
It's what they are. I heard Mike Bloomberg, when he was mayor, made a point that's always stuck with me. And somebody asked, what's the difference between running Bloomberg and running New York City? He was mayor at the time. And he says, in a business, you try to identify where resources are not being effectively used and redirect them from that to areas where they're highly productive. You don't always succeed, but that's the effort. And he said politics is the exact opposite. It's trying to take resources from where they're highly productive and withdrawing them from that, hoping that the productivity doesn't collapse, and redirecting them to where they're not productive. And that's what it's about. You may or may not like it, but that's, I don't like opera. Don't go to opera if you don't like opera, right? And we have governments, and that's what they're first and foremost about. So do I think things like you're describing, are they troublesome? Look, the whole point of Freddie and Fannie and not the VAJ, but Freddie and Fannie was, we wanted to expand housing credit access. Why? That was a redistributional. We wanted, and we do it imperfectly, but we wanted to expand, no different than public education or no different than all kinds of things that we do. Parks. And, you could say, well, why is the government doing it? You say, because they're good at redistribution. They may not be perfect, but look, the private redistribution you tend to do with a very few close people and criminals, right? So criminals redistribute, but I don't think we're kind of thrilled about that redistribution. Yeah. And privately, we redistribute, but in a pretty small circle. So if your goal is a broader redistribution, you almost necessarily end up there. And that's what governments do. And Freddie and Fannie are doing it again. Not shocking. Will it have implications? Yes. Will it encourage at the margin subprime or more loan defaults? Of course. Will it bring down the system? Stay tuned. It's an empirical question. It's not a theoretical question. The incentive is a theoretical. Then the question is, well, how big will it really be, right? If you put a whole bunch of sweets out on the table, theoretically, we're both going to eat some, or we have an incentive to eat some. But it doesn't mean we will, and it doesn't mean we'll gorge ourselves. That's an empirical question. So what they've done is give an incentive to have defaults. But they want that because their view is the people who are potentially defaulting deserve credit too. That's not going to be given otherwise, and they want it given. Okay, but that's just redistribution. So if you think about government, you and I have had these conversations about what should government do. In my view, one, they should do things that have huge free rider problems. Like, I don't think I'm going to buy an F-16. First of all, I don't think I could afford it, and I don't think you're going to chip in to my private buying an F-16, because if it's protecting me and you're my neighbor, it's also protecting you without you paying, right? And so you say, okay, I get it. That's kind of cumbersome, military, and you could argue police. There are others, and then you're just down to where empirically does the boundary hit. And then there's other things, which is, I don't like the way resources are distributed. So yes, I love the way capitalism creates resources, unmatched in history at creating resources. But that doesn't mean I like how it distributes resources, right? And as I say, the private sector can redistribute resources, but in small circles generally. And so we say, oh, I want to do it bigger than that. Well, then that's where government comes in, and that's their job. So I don't begrudge them doing it, although I may personally not like how it's being done, but in a funny way, that's their job. And you may say, well, let's let them, I would say, let's cut back their job description. That's a separate discussion, right? Let's cut back the job description. But taking this little example of Freddie, Fannie, you can't blame them if their job description is to redistribute for doing something like that. Now, you could say maybe you could do it better. That's a separate discussion.
Do you think the government has a role in city zoning? I know that Houston, for example, is an example of a city with no zoning code.
But they do have a lot of, this is very much Ronald Coase theorem. They do have a lot of long-dated restrictions put on by the original owners. Okay, so I originally owned this land, and I said, you can buy it to build a house on, but you can't put a tannery on it. Can't put a slaughterhouse on it. Why? Because I've got other property and I want to sell it. So Houston has a number of long dated, going back to the original subdivisions, that do some of that.
It's an example of the private
market. That's private
marketing,
trying to internalize externalities, right? And go back, we were talking about the Fed. When does zoning come about? I want to say Siegel, not Jeremy Siegel. It's an old paper. must be back in the 70s, maybe, that looks at Houston and argues that you don't need zoning. And there are other places that you don't need zoning. But it also discusses the history and when does zoning come about as a major phenomena. 1910s, 1920s, which was a rampant period, good or bad, it was a rampant period of socialism. And by the way, again, you need a historical perspective. There was a lot of things capitalism was doing, it doesn't always work. You and I believe in capitalism. But it's a struggle to say we should let heroin be given to 4-year-olds, right? And you say, well, but if they want to buy it, right, that would be capitalism if they want to buy it. And you go, yeah, I don't know, we need to put some all-knowing, omnipotent, benevolent being should be doing it, right? So you and I could quickly get there. Well, there was in the air, in the period where zoning began, was we got to do something. But interesting, you look at London. London, as it evolved, was not a zoned city. It had covenants in many cases. I just read a book, it's a quite good book, woman up at Harvard, I think at Harvard, on how back in the 1700s, the lords divided up their land, and they didn't have zoning. Paris, what you see at Paris was not the result of zoning. It was housemen, and they had lands and they tore down, they built. La Défense, that's zoning, right? That was kind of the socialist outcropping.
What about New York? New York probably zoning.
Well, it depends when, right? Downtown, originally less, and as you come forward in time, so the big immigration, I don't know, this article talked about it, I can't remember, but yeah, I mean, let's face it, the big immigration, the big population growth in the United States come post 1900. So, but Philadelphia was William Penn. The 4 squares, the street grid, that was not zoned. That was William Penn, owned all the land, had what we would today call a master plan. And he developed his master plan to maximize profits of selling the land. But it wasn't zoned. So core Philadelphia is a perfect example. It was not zoning that did it. Now, since then, zoning's come in and overlaid it. But the original colonial, which a lot of it still exists, that was not zoning driven.
Interesting.
So could we get a system without zoning? Sure. And it gets down really to which is more costly to do and enforce, right? What's the nice thing about zoning? You go to a book and it says this is what you can do. That's what's the bad thing about zoning. It's stupid.
Yeah.
What they say you can do. What's the good thing about not zoning? I can do some clever things. What's the bad part of it? I have to figure out if I have the right to do it or if there are these covenants out there going back to when William Penn did it, right? And and you have to research that, right? So It's really about the costs of it. There's no doubt zoning does some really stupid stuff. On the other hand, probably some rough cuts. It's not so stupid, right? Putting residential kind of next to residential a lot of the time and not having a slaughterhouse near them, not so stupid. Would we have probably gotten to that without it? Yeah. You don't see a lot of slaughterhouses located next to residential neighborhoods in Houston.
Yeah. I think lobbyists, like if you're a big corporation, you can lobby the government to change the zoning for you to zoning code for you to build something where, let's say, a commercial property where it's residential, etc. So I think those are,
of course, and you have the right
issues.
In a democracy. You should have the right to lobby your government, right? And I'm not saying bribe them, but lobby them and do whatever you need to do to try to convince them to your position, short of bribery. And I mean, you're interesting. If you were to look at my Vita, there's no reason you would, you'd see an odd paper. You'd see a lot of odd papers. I've written over 100 papers and published over 100. One of them is on mattress flammability standards. Now, if you go back to the 1970s, the Consumer Product Safety Commission only comes about, I think, in 1974. There was nothing before that. And they come into existence and they start putting all these regulations on. And I had kind of a hunch along the lines you were saying about the lobbying and so forth. So I looked at something fairly innocuous. You have this little thing saying, it passes this test and so forth. And it was a regulation put on. And the regulation essentially amounted to how long can you have a burning cigarette on a mattress without it catching fire? But there are other ways mattresses can catch on fire and so forth. And so it doesn't mention whether there was alcohol spilled on it or, and so forth. Okay. And what I looked at, this was in early days of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, was what companies' mattresses just happened to meet the standards. And guess what? Originally, all the companies opposed flammability standards for mattresses. It was a very fragmented industry. But by the time the regulation was implemented, it just so happened that the big companies' mattresses passed the standard. And the small guys, most of them didn't. Just kind of happened that way, I guess. And of course, it didn't kind of just happen. Had no impact, that particular one, I'm not saying all regulations, had no identifiable impact on fires, had no identifiable impact on burns, had no identifiable impact on deaths from things, but had huge distributional impacts on prices in the industry because suddenly you didn't satisfy and I did. And I wonder how that happened. Do you think lobbying might have had anything to do with that?
It seems to me. I don't know. Maybe.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Maybe.
So we went there a few years ago, Dr. Linneman. I had the privilege of joining you on this trip to Kenya.
Yeah.
And you founded SAM, Save a Mind.
Yeah, Save a Mind. Give a choice. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can share with the audience a little bit about SAM.
Yeah.
How did it come about? What inspired you to found it? And what would you say that is the definition of a fulfilling and successful life? I know it changes according to person.
No, that's good. Okay, so I went the first time with two like daughters of ours in, I think it was late 2002. And I didn't want to go. I'm not a big nature person. I'm not anti-nature. It's just not I like cities. I like concrete and so on. Nature for very short times. But the girls were like 20, 22 at the time. They wanted to go on safari. And I figured they're going to have husbands and babies soon enough. I was right. So let's do it. We had a great time. We did 9 days, 3 different camps, like we rotated through. Three camps. And at the end, the last day, I said to our guide, who I think you met, Karmushu, who developed into a manager at one of the resorts, this is all great, but what about people? And he took us to, and there was no mandatory education. It was grim. And we said, okay, we got to do something. And we talked about it. And we said, it's cruel to put a kid through school for 1 year. I mean, if you had a child, you wouldn't say, okay, I'm putting you through the first grade, but after that, no commitments, right? No parent would do that.
Yeah.
Even the most neglectful parent doesn't even do that, right? In our world. So when you say, okay, I'm going to do a check, and all we're going to do is support this year, it's well intended, but it's actually unintentionally cruel because the kid went through first grade and now what, right? So we made a commitment to 4 children who were 12 at the time that we would support their lives until they're done with their education and help them make a little transition. And one girl had run away. She was 12. She was being married to somebody like 46 as his 5th wife. She refused to go, had great fortitude, she's not the most brilliant. She's smart, but she's not the most brilliant, but she's got fortitude like a Mandela, right? And so that was in 2003. There were 3 others. They all ended up graduating university. They've all gone on to kind of move into their world, right? And kind of bridging the old world and the modern world. Very sad. And we're with you all the way through as long as you do your stuff. If you need shoes, we'll get you shoes. You need clothes, we'll get you clothes, as you know. And books, we'll get you books. We'll send you to mostly private schools or magnet schools. Private schools are hardly choate. You saw them. They're dormitory kind of things. They're better than the other schools. So over the years, we've done about 110 have graduated. Our youngest start, what would you say? Probably 8 you saw, right? Something like that. And our oldest, we have a couple in graduate school. Some stop after high school. Some go for what we would call like an associate degree in cosmetology or auto mechanics or something. Some go to 4-year universities. We, in addition to doing their education, their life support, food, whatever, about half are orphans. About half of the ones that aren't orphans, in a way, would be better off if they were. And they have parents with a parent, usually single parent, with severe challenges, alcoholism or whatever it might be, as well as a lack of resources, financial resources. We have a great staff. We have sessions with them every 5 weeks. We do a Zoom. I mentioned the one with Bryce Blair on leadership, but we had, the Eras does sessions with us. He's doing a book reading club. My brother Doug, who was in the hospitality business, has the students that are in hospitality, studying hospitality. He does about once a month on tips about the hospitality industry and how to treat customers. We do our once every 5 weeks, and we've done how do you do an interview, you get a job, what mistakes do people make. But we also did Winston Churchill. We also did Margaret Thatcher. They also wanted to do Muammar Gaddafi. And, we'll share YouTubes, and then we'll have conversations about the YouTubes. We have sessions on non-academic topics like how do you open a bank account? How do you keep track of your money? How do you do a budget? On how do you avoid getting pregnant, responsibilities, and so forth. So it's much richer than even when you were there in terms of this support beyond school. Are we changing the world? Everybody who doesn't have to suffer through the darkness of total ignorance has to make the world better in some way. Are we going to create world peace? I doubt it. But these kids are going to ripple through all their lives in ways I'll never know. And what could be greater than these kids rippling through life? Some of them have some very good jobs. As you know, most of them are around your age, a few older, some younger. And so it's very heartening. We've had about 8 out of 250 who dropped, about half because of teenage pregnancy. We didn't drop them, they dropped. And then about half, come on, if you have 250 kids, you're going to have 4 clunkers, And that's the disheartening thing. The disheartening thing is when it crushes, it just crushes when somebody drops, because what their life holds better than they do, and it's dark, and that the light may not be perfect, but there's hope and joy and an opportunity the other direction. And and it's been very rewarding. And like most things, you start out thinking you're doing it for them, and you find out you did it. I've learned more from them than they've learned from me. You were there. You probably learned more from them than you taught them in your time with them. They don't teach us the same things, right? We learn different things. We have about 140 kids in the pipeline. I hesitate to call them kids because if I was 22 years old or 20 years old, somebody would have called me a kid. I'd have said, hey, I'm not a kid, But, they range in all kind of ages. I was just on, what's today? So on Thursday, I did a Zoom with the incoming 10th graders, 9th graders, incoming 9th graders session, and an hour, 45 minutes, I guess, with them. It's not perfect, but the staff is incredible. Kids are incredible. Kids are kids. They are all insecure. They all think their friends like somebody else better. They all are terrified they won't succeed. They all don't know how to get a job. They all, don't know.
Yeah.
The manifestations of their challenges are a little different than here. You probably know that better from your background, probably not your personal, but the nationality and region. They're just kids. And when they do great things, it's impressive. And when they do stupid things, you go, they're kids. You kind of pull yourself through.
Yeah, I think the most impressive thing from the time that I was there, of course, I was a lot younger than what I am right now, but is the idea, you always come back to the point that, are we changing the world or not?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people now, it's too easy with Instagram and social media. Yeah. They spend time complaining and without cleaning house first themselves.
Yeah, of course.
And the impact, even if you impact one or two people, in this case 200 people, or it's a lot.
And the people they impact, and the people they impact, and by the way, they're young. It's like the people you're going to impact, not just today, but forever, right? So that's the real joy.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for the time.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's been a great joy, and thank you very kindly.
Yeah, excellent. And thanks everyone for joining. If you'd like a free sample of the Linneman Letter, Dr. Linneman's unique quarterly commercial real estate publication, all you have to do is subscribe to the channel and leave us your email in the comment section below, and we'll make sure our team sends you the sample. Also, make sure to check out Sam. We'll put the link below also, and make a small contribution to help support children's education in Kenya. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.